A woman who could have written a check with more zeros than I've ever seen in my life stood in the middle of her late father's workshop and asked me. A guy with plaster dust in his hair and a cracked thumbnail that hadn't healed right in 3 weeks. To please just tell her what was wrong with his table saw. Not fix it. Just tell her what was wrong with it. And I looked at her, and I looked at the saw, and I said I didn't want the $10,000 she was offering. I wanted an old folding ruler. The kind carpenters don't even use anymore. The kind that folds up in sections, yellow paint mostly gone, numbers rubbed off the first few inches from years of use. She stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But within about 20 minutes of that moment, that saw was going to run again for the first time since her father died. And not because I'm any kind of genius. I want to be honest with you about that from the very start. I'm not. I'm a general contractor who runs a 3-man crew out of Guelph, Ontario, and I have calluses on my hands, and I still drive the same pickup truck I bought used 11 years ago. But every one of those high-end restoration experts she'd brought in before me had walked into that workshop and seen a machine. And I walked in and recognized a man. But before I tell you about the ruler and about what it is that makes a woman who could buy absolutely anything she wants, drop into a chair and press both hands over her face, and just come completely undone, let me ask you something first. If you have ever lost somebody and you would trade almost anything you own just to hear one completely ordinary, everyday sound of them one more time, the way they cleared their throat, the particular squeak of their chair, the sound of them moving around in the next room, hit that subscribe button right now. This whole channel is for the people who know that the smallest things end up holding the most. Go ahead. I'll be here. Then let me tell you about a man named Bernard Kowalczyk and about the 14 years I spent watching him work. My name is Joe Mack. I'm 41 years old. I've been in the trade since I was 19. When I dropped out of a business degree I had no business being in and started swinging a hammer for my uncle's renovation company in Hamilton, learned framing, then drywalling, then finished carpentry, then just about everything else. Eventually struck out on my own. It's not glamorous work. It's early mornings and sore knees and estimating jobs wrong sometimes and eating the difference. But it's mine, and I'm good at it, and I built it with my own hands the same way my dad built his plumbing business. One job at a time, one handshake at a time, until the phone rang on its own. I need to tell you something right up front, because without it, none of what comes next is going to land the way it actually happened. My dad passed 14 months ago. Colon cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by October. 8 months from the first appointment to the last one. I'm going to come back to that because it ended up being the whole reason I could see what no one else in that workshop could see. But I need you to hold it somewhere in the back of your mind while I tell you the rest of it. I met Bernard Kowalczyk through work. He was a client, or he started out as one. He'd hired my crew to do a kitchen renovation in his house out in Rockwood, about 20 minutes east of Guelph. And from the very first day on site, I could tell he was the kind of man who was going to be in the way the entire time. Not in a bad way. In the way that a man is in the way when he genuinely loves what's being done and can't make himself stay out of it. He had retired a few years earlier from running a mid-sized manufacturing company he'd built up himself over 30-some years. The kind of company that made unglamorous, necessary things, industrial fasteners, if you want the specifics, and made them reliably and well, and made Bernard a very comfortable man in the process. But money had not made him soft. He still had the hands of someone who'd worked with them his whole life, broad and scarred and knowing. And he was in that kitchen every single morning when my guys showed up, coffee already made, questions ready. He asked smart questions, not the annoying kind that slow you down and make you feel like you're being supervised. The kind that tell you a man actually understands what he's looking at, and is genuinely curious about the choices being made. And somewhere around the 3rd week, he stopped asking about the kitchen and started asking about me, about how I ran the business, about my daughter, Abigail. She was 4 at the time, and I had a picture of her taped to the inside of my work bag, which he noticed because Bernard noticed everything, about her mother who had left when Abigail was 18 months old and who was not really in the picture in any meaningful way. And he told me about his wife, Yvette, who had died of a stroke 6 years before, and about how the house felt different after that, The way a room feels different when a lamp is removed that you'd stop noticing was even on. We were friends before the kitchen was finished. The real kind. The kind that doesn't need a reason. Over the next 14 years I did probably a dozen projects in his home. Rebuilt the back deck, finished the basement, replaced all the windows, and every single time, same thing. Bernard in the way, coffee made, questions ready. He'd retired, but he hadn't stopped. He had a workshop in his detached garage that he'd spent years building into something serious. A proper woodworking setup. Table saw, jointer, bandsaw, drill press, a wall of hand tools organized with a precision that bordered on the ceremonial. He built furniture in there. Not as a hobby exactly. It was more serious than that. He built things for people he loved. A blanket chest for his daughter when she got married. A cradle for each grandchild. A set of kitchen chairs for his sister out in Thunder Bay. And I got to see all of it, because he always wanted a second opinion on the joints. He'd call me over sometimes just to look at something, not because he needed my help, but because he wanted someone to see it. To understand what the thing had taken. I came to know that workshop the way I know my own job sites. I knew the way the light came through the high window in the late afternoon and caught the sawdust in the air. I knew the smell of it, pine and machine oil, and the particular dusty warmth of a shop that gets used every single day. I knew the tools, every one of them, and most of all I knew the table saw. It was a vintage beaver cabinet saw, probably from the late 60s, the kind of Canadian-made tool that doesn't exist anymore, and that serious woodworkers treat with a reverence bordering on religious. Bernard had bought it secondhand in the early 90s from a retiring cabinet maker in Kitchener, and had spent years tuning it to a level of precision that would make some of the new stuff look embarrassed. He loved that saw the way certain men love a particular car, or a particular rifle, not as a possession but as a relationship, as a thing you learn and that learns you back over years and years of use until you and it are doing something together that neither of you could manage alone. Bernard died in March, his heart in his sleep at 79, which is about the most decent exit a man can hope for. I put on the same dark jacket I'd worn to my own father's funeral less than a year and a half before, and I drove out to Rockwood for the service, and I sat near the back and grieved quietly for a man who had been, in many ways, the older friend I'd needed more than I'd ever known I needed. His daughter is named Caroline. Caroline Kowalczyk. She's in her early 50s, lives in Toronto, and had built her own company in commercial real estate that had made her, by any measure, a genuinely wealthy woman. She and I had met a handful of times over the years when she visited her father. She knew who I was. She knew what I'd meant to him, I think, at least in the way children know things about their parents without being told directly. About 4 months after Bernard died, I got a call from her. She told me the workshop was locked up, that she'd been up to Rockwood a few times to start dealing with the estate, and that every time she went into that workshop she just couldn't do anything in there. Couldn't sort through it, couldn't think about what to sell or keep or donate. Said it still smelled like him and that she'd stand in the doorway and not be able to make herself cross it. But here was the specific thing she was calling about. Before she could do any of that, she needed the table saw to run. Just run. Just once. She couldn't explain it exactly, she said, except that it was important, the way certain things are important without being sensible. The saw would not start. It had been sitting since he died. She'd tried it herself. She'd had an electrician check the wiring. She'd called a tool repair shop in Guelph that worked on vintage machinery, and they'd sent someone out who'd spent 2 hours on it and left shaking his head. She'd posted in a woodworking forum online and gotten advice from 17 different people, tried 6 of the suggestions, and the saw had not started. She'd finally, in what she described to me as a moment of complete irrationality, posted publicly in a local Facebook group offering $10,000 to anyone who could get the saw running again. The comments, she said, had been a mix of people calling it a scam and people genuinely trying to help, and she'd had 4 more people come to the house. One of them who described himself as a certified millwright, another who restored antique machinery as a profession, and none of them had been able to do it. The motor was fine, the wiring tested clean. Mechanically, by every account, the saw was in perfect shape. It simply would not start. She called me almost as an afterthought, she said. She apologized for not thinking of me sooner. She said she knew I wasn't an electrician or a machinery specialist, but that her father had trusted me more than anyone, and that I had known the saw. I almost said no. I want to be straight with you about that. I had a job running in Fergus that needed my attention, and I was still worn down in a way that had been sitting on me since my dad died, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fully fix. I wasn't looking for a side project or a puzzle to solve. But I had liked Bernard Kowalczyk for 14 years. So I drove out to Rockwood on a Saturday morning, my daughter Abigail in the back seat. She was 9 by then, and had her library book and her earbuds in and was content, and I pulled into the driveway of that house for what I understood was probably the last time. Caroline met me at the door. She was put together in the way of a person who is used to being put together in professional situations, but underneath it she had the specific exhaustion I recognized, the flatness around the eyes, the slightly too careful composure. I had worn it myself to jobs in the weeks after my dad passed, when you keep functioning because you have to, but there's a lag between what's happening and where you actually are. I said I was sorry about her father. I told her he had been one of the best people I'd worked alongside in 20 years of doing this, and that I meant that in the full sense of the word alongside. Not just a client, not just a nice man, but someone I'd actually learned things from. Her composure cracked a little around the edges when I said it, just for a second. I think it might have been the first time, in the whole process of dealing with the estate and the service and the paperwork and the 4 months of logistics, that someone had said something about who he actually was. Then I asked her a question. I said, "Caroline, when you went through your father's things, his workbench, his apron, whatever he kept close when he worked, was there a folding ruler, an old one, wooden, yellow paint, folds in 6 sections? He would have kept it in his left apron pocket. Every single time I ever saw him working, it was in his left apron pocket." She looked at me for a moment without saying anything. Then she said yes. She said she thought she'd seen it somewhere, that there had been so many tools to catalog and she hadn't known what to do with any of it. But yes, she thought she remembered a folding ruler. "That's what I want," I said. "Not the 10,000. I want that ruler." She didn't laugh. She looked at me the same way I imagine. I looked the first time Bernard asked me a question about framing that revealed he already understood more than most people I'd worked with. Like she was recalibrating. Like she was deciding whether to trust something. She sent someone to find the ruler, and while they were looking, I walked into the workshop. Let me tell you what I knew that none of those other people did. It had nothing to do with electrical work or mechanical expertise. It had to do with knowing a man. Bernard Kowalczyk had a system. I had watched it for 14 years. He was not a man who left things to chance or to other people's assumptions. He was not a man who trusted the obvious interpretation of a situation. He was the kind of man who, when he left a job site or a machine for any extended period, locked things down in his own specific way. Not the standard way, his way. The beaver saw had a magnetic safety switch, a feature on a lot of older cabinet saws, a simple but reliable system where the switch drops out and locks off if power is interrupted, to prevent the saw from restarting unexpectedly when power comes back on. Standard stuff. Every one of the people who'd looked at it would have checked that switch first thing, and they had. Caroline confirmed that everyone who came had reset the switch, checked it, confirmed it was functional. And it was. It tested fine. But here's what they didn't know, and what I knew, because I had watched Bernard work that saw 1,000 times, and had seen him do a specific thing that I had asked about once and that he'd explained with the particular patience of a man. Sharing something he'd figured out the hard way. The saw also had an auxiliary lockout, not factory. Bernard had added it himself years ago, after a break-in attempt on the garage that hadn't gotten through the locks but had rattled him enough to take precautions. A secondary cutoff wired into the system himself, with a switch hidden behind a removable section of the saw's lower cabinet panel. A piece of trim that looked like it was just covering the motor housing, that blended in completely, that you would have no reason to look behind unless someone had told you it was there. When he was done working for any extended period, going on vacation, closing the shop for the winter, anything longer than a few days, Bernard locked out the auxiliary switch. Always. It was as automatic for him as turning off the lights. He had told me about it one afternoon when I was helping him move the saw to redo the workshop floor, and I'd noticed the extra wiring and asked. He'd shown me the panel and said, matter-of-factly, that he didn't trust machines to stay put just because they were switched off, and that he preferred to know for certain. Nobody else knew about it. It wasn't in any documentation. It wasn't visible. It was the kind of detail that lived only in the knowledge of a man and the person or people he'd chosen to explain it to. The saw hadn't developed a fault. It didn't have a ghost in it. Bernard had simply locked it down the last time he'd finished working, the way he always did, the way he always would, and then he had gone inside for dinner and gone to bed and not woken up again. And the saw had been sitting there ever since, waiting with the faithful, literal patience of a machine for someone to come along who knew about the panel. I found the auxiliary switch behind the trim piece. I flipped it to the run position. Then I walked to the main switch and pushed the green button. The beaver cabinet saw started on the first try. I want to try and describe the sound of it, because the sound is the whole thing. A saw like that doesn't just switch on. It takes a second to come up to speed, and there's a progression to it. A low start that climbs and steadies into this deep, even, purposeful drone that fills the whole room and seems to come from the walls as much as the machine itself. A sound that takes years to produce because it takes years to tune. It is not just a motor running. It is something that has been listened to and adjusted and cared for until it runs exactly right, and when it does, you can hear the care in it. I stood there with my hand on the housing and let it run, and from the doorway, Caroline Kowalczyk made a sound that I will not try to describe in detail, except to say that it was not a cry, exactly, and it was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something comes back that they had accepted was gone, when a space that had been empty fills with something it used to hold. She had her hand pressed hard over her mouth, and she was shaking her head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the way of someone absorbing something too large to take in straight. Because she was hearing him. The particular sound of that saw, tuned to that specific pitch by her father's hands over 30 years, running in the workshop he had built, filling the space where he had spent his happiest hours. She had not been able to cross the doorway of that workshop for 4 months, and now she was standing in it with the sound of her father all around her. I let it run for about a minute, and then I shut it down. You don't run a machine that's been sitting through a Canadian winter for any longer than you need to without checking the lubrication properly, and Bernard would have had strong opinions about that, and I respected him enough not to ignore them. The silence after it stopped was different from the silence before it started. The before silence was the absence of something. This was the silence of a room that still held the echo of what it had just heard. It was the same silence I had sat in my dad's kitchen, the week after we buried him, when I'd gone over to start sorting things and had stood for a long time at the counter where he used to stand to do the crossword every morning. Just stood there, listening for something I already knew wasn't going to come. My dad had a particular way of tapping his pen on the table when he was stuck on a clue. 3 quick taps, then a pause, then he'd start writing again. I had heard that sound 10,000 times without ever once consciously registering it, and I would have given an embarrassing amount to hear it one more time. That's what grief actually is, I've come to understand. It isn't the obvious landmarks. The first Christmas, the birthday that comes and goes wrong. Those hurt, but you can brace for them. The ones that take your legs out from under you are the small sounds, the incidental ones, the ones you never thought to memorize because you never imagined they would end. The refrigerator hum of an ordinary afternoon, a specific laugh, the sound of someone's particular footstep on a particular floor. Once the people stop dropping off food and the cards stop coming, grief settles into the quiet places, into the sounds that aren't there anymore. I had learned that in my father's kitchen, and that kitchen, without me knowing it at the time, had been getting me ready for what I was going to need to understand in Bernard's workshop. Caroline and I sat in 2 old wooden chairs Bernard had built and not yet gifted to anyone, out in the pale March light coming through the high workshop windows. We sat for a while without talking, which is the only honest response to some moments. Then we did talk for a long time. She told me about her father the way you tell someone about a person when you've been keeping it banked up because there hasn't been a safe place to let it out. I told her about my dad, about the crossword and the pen, about the specific absences that had surprised me, about how grief had a way of disassembling you, and then, if you were unlucky enough and lucky enough at the same time, using the pieces to help you be useful to the next person it took apart. At some point, she asked me why I hadn't wanted the $10,000. I took a minute before I answered, because I wanted to get it right. I said that taking $10,000 to start her father's saw would have felt, to me, like charging a grieving daughter admission to hear her own father's voice, like showing up at a graveside with a price list. Bernard Kowalczyk had been my friend for 14 years, and in 14 years he had never once asked what a job would cost before I started it, because he had trusted me to be fair, and I had trusted that he would recognize fairness when he saw it. Charging his daughter money to give her back 30 seconds of him would have been the most disloyal thing I could have done to a man who had given me his complete trust for a decade and a half. Besides, I said, the ruler. He had carried that ruler in his left apron pocket every single day for as long as I had known him, worn smooth on the brass hinges. The first 2 sections almost illegible from use. I had seen it in his hand 100 times, measuring nothing that needed measuring because he just liked to have it. Liked the feel of a good old tool, the way it folded and unfolded with a satisfying precision. Holding that ruler in my hand now was, for me, like hearing a particular sound, like a small concrete proof that the person had been real and had been here and had left a mark on something that you could hold. That was worth more to me than $10,000. Not metaphorically, literally. Caroline was quiet for a moment after I said all that. Then she told me about Abigail. She had seen her through the workshop window, in the truck, doing something with a book, asked how old she was, asked about school, asked about her. The way Bernard always had, I realized. The noticing habit. I supposed you came by it honestly if you'd been raised by him. I told her about the business, about what things were like for a small contractor in the current market, about the way the cost of materials had changed the math on smaller jobs, in ways that were genuinely hard to manage. Not complaining, it's the business I chose. But honestly, because she'd asked honestly and something about the afternoon had made it feel right to answer that way. And what she did next was not what I expected. She did not write a check. I think she understood by then that a check would have undone something that had happened between us that afternoon, would have put a frame around it that made it transactional and therefore smaller than it was. Instead, she asked if she could call me the following week to talk about a project. Her company had recently acquired a commercial property in Guelph. An older building, good bones, needed a serious renovation to bring it up to where it needed to be for the tenant they had in mind. She needed a contractor she could trust to be straight with her. Someone her father had trusted, she said, was a reasonable place to start. That was 11 months ago. I'm not going to pretend the contract changed everything overnight, because the trades don't work that way and neither does anything real. But it was the biggest single project my crew had ever taken on, and we did good work on it. Work I'm proud of, and she was fair in every way that mattered and in several ways I hadn't expected. She referred us to 2 other people in her professional circle before the job was even done, and my daughter Abigail, who I have been setting aside a little from every job since she was born, has a registered education savings account that, for the first time since I started it, actually looks like it's going to be enough. Caroline did it in the way that I could accept without losing the thing about that afternoon that mattered. Not charity. Just the next right thing, offered by someone who understood that there are ways to help people, and ways to help people, and that the difference is everything. I still have the ruler. It's on my workbench at the shop, next to my own measuring tape, and a level my dad gave me when I first went out on my own. 19 years old and absolutely clueless and holding a tool I didn't yet know how to deserve. The folding ruler and the level, side by side. 2 men I learned things from. 2 men who are gone and not gone, the way people are when they've been woven into how you move through the world. Some mornings when I get to the shop early, before the crew arrives, I'll pick up the ruler and open and close it once, just feeling the hinges. The precise, worn, satisfying click of it folding closed. And I think about a man in a sawdust-smelling workshop in Rockwood, who always had it in his left pocket, and about my dad at the kitchen table with his crossword, and about how the whole reason I could walk into that workshop and see what needed to be seen was that grief had already broken me open in exactly the right way. I drove home from Rockwood that afternoon with Abigail asking me, very practically, whether I had fixed the big saw, and whether the lady had been nice. I told her yes on both counts. She thought about that for a moment and then asked whether fixing it had been hard. I said no, actually. I said it had been pretty easy. She wanted to know how, if it had stumped so many other people. I thought about it for a second. Then I said, because I knew the man who built it. Because when you actually know someone, the small habits, the particular reasons behind the particular choices, what looks complicated from the outside is usually just a set of decisions that make perfect sense once you understand who was making them. She nodded, working through this in the way she works through things, quietly and all the way. Then, she asked if we were stopping for Tim Hortons on the way back. We were. I want to ask you something before I go. A room full of qualified experts came in and saw a machine with a fault, and one regular contractor came in and saw a man he'd known for 14 years. And that was the only difference between weeks of failure and 20 minutes of getting it right. All of which brings me to this. What is the small sound? The pen tapping, the chair scraping, the particular way someone said your name, that you would give almost anything to hear just one more time. Tell me about it in the comments. Say their name if you want to. I read them, and I would be genuinely glad to know. And if this story reached you tonight, if you've ever stood somewhere quiet, and caught yourself listening for something that isn't there anymore, hit subscribe if you haven't. Leave a like so someone else can find their way here too. Leave your story below. I'll see you in the next one.